The pastor raised his hand, looked over the congregation, and said, "Let us thank Linda Caldwell for her extraordinary generosity." My breath stopped cold. The stained glass windows threw colored light across the pews, and in that light I saw my daughter stand up to applause that was meant for me. My name is Miriam Caldwell. I am 78 years old, a widow, and for over 40 years I kept the Caldwell grocery on Main Street in our small Ohio town. I survived on thin profit margins, worked long nights, and kept an old leather ledger where I wrote down every dime owed and every debt forgiven. With every entry, I believed I was building not just a business but a reputation of fairness, something to hand down as honor, not shame. That morning, in the house of God, I felt that honor being stripped from me. Linda is my eldest child, a woman sharp in ambition and smooth with words, and she stood in front of the altar with her hands clasped as though humility lived in her veins. The people clapped harder, whispering about her sacrifice, about how rare it was for a younger generation to give so much. Pastor Daniel, who has led this congregation for over 20 years, smiled with the certainty of a man convinced he was blessing the right soul. Yet he had spoken my name when he first gave thanks. My name, not hers. That had happened because of one envelope, a plain white one I had placed in the offering plate, filled with money I had saved from selling the last shelves and coolers of my store. I wanted it to be a quiet act of devotion, something between me and my God, but somehow that envelope had ended up in Linda's hand. Now, in front of everyone, she bowed her head as if she had given the sum, as if the years of standing behind that counter belonged to her. The murmurs reached me. Linda is such a blessing. Her mother must be proud, proud. I sat stiff, my fingers digging into the wood of the pew, my heart hammering against the betrayal. It was not the money. It was the theft of recognition, the erasure of my own offering. I thought of the mornings when I had risen before dawn, the winters when I sold groceries on credit so families could eat. That was what those bills represented, the bones of a life built from discipline and sacrifice. When Pastor Daniel glanced again and repeated, "We thank Linda for carrying the Caldwell legacy forward," I saw a flicker cross his face, as if he had realized something was off. He had read the name Miriam Caldwell on the slip inside, yet Linda stood there, owning it. The congregation never questioned, they accepted the performance. Because people prefer the story that flatters their expectations. The successful daughter stepping in where the mother has grown old. I wanted to rise, to correct it, but the hush of reverence held me down. If I spoke, I would look petty, jealous, ungrateful for a daughter's supposed gift. And Linda knew it. She met my eyes just long enough, her lips lifting in a smile that carried no warmth, only possession. That moment was a knife slid clean under my ribs. After the service, handshakes and congratulations flowed toward Linda. Women pressed her palms, men nodded approval, children admired her. I stood alone at the edge, invisible. Pastor Daniel approached me, his voice kind but distracted, as though he were speaking to an elder losing touch. "Miriam, isn't it wonderful what Linda has done for the church? You raised her well, raised her well." Those words, once meant as praise, landed like a verdict of failure. The sanctuary emptied, leaving the scent of candle wax and polished wood. Linda remained at the front, speaking with Grace Miller, her friend from college who had married into money and never let the town forget it. Grace's laugh carried through the high ceiling as she clutched Linda's arm. I caught fragments. "This will look perfect when we launch the cafe project." CAF project, I knew nothing of it. I walked past them slowly, deliberately, forcing my steps to echo on the tiles. Neither turned to acknowledge me. For the first time in my life, I understood how it felt to be a stranger in my own family's story. I carried home a bulletin from the service, my name written neatly under donations received. The proof was right there in black ink, but no one cared to see it. What people saw was Linda, radiant under the cross, hands folded as if piety had been her lifelong companion. They saw what they wanted to believe, that the new generation had stepped up, while the old one faded quietly into the shadows. That evening, I sat by the window where the last light of day brushed the curtains. I placed the bulletin beside my ledger, the one I had carried for decades, leather worn smooth from my hands. 2 books, both with my name, both testaments to truth. Yet out in the world, Linda's smile had rewritten the story already. I whispered aloud to the silence, not in despair but in clarity. If she can steal this, she can steal anything. And with that thought, I knew my fight was only beginning. The morning after the service, I found an envelope slid under my door. Inside was a thank you note from the church office, typed neatly on letterhead, with my name on it. The words praised my generous spirit and unwavering commitment. Yet in town, everyone repeated Linda's name as if the donation had come from her heart. The letter was proof. But proof meant nothing when perception had already been bought and sold. By the end of that week, whispers grew louder. At the market, I heard two women comparing Linda's generosity to the decline of older folks who had little left to give. I held a basket of apples, my hands tightening around the stems, knowing I had given more than they would ever know. No one looked me in the eye. They were comfortable believing I had become irrelevant. That evening, my son Mark came by. He has always been the quieter one, the boy who never sought center stage, but he carried himself with the calm of a man who had already chosen sides. He sat at my kitchen table and told me not to worry, that Linda was only stepping up where I couldn't. His words stung more than silence. He pulled out a form, crisp and official looking, with lines for signatures. "It's just to help manage things," he said. "Bills, accounts, decisions you don't need to stress over." I stared at the paper. It was a power of attorney, plain as daylight, dressed up as kindness. I refused to sign, sliding the paper back across the table. He smiled, but his eyes stayed flat, no warmth behind them. "Linda just wants to help. Don't make this harder." Then he folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket as if time would soften my resolve. I realized in that moment that he wasn't neutral at all. He was choosing ease over truth. Later that night, I opened my ledger, the leather one I had kept since the store's earliest days. My handwriting filled page after page, names of neighbors, amounts they owed, and the word paid written when debts were cleared. Some pages carried notes like family seek wait until spring or husband laid off no charge. It was my proof, my record of sacrifice, not as charity but as responsibility. If Linda and Mark pushed hard enough, even this could be twisted into something ugly. A few days later, Pastor Daniel visited. He stood at my door with his hat in his hands, the picture of politeness. "Miriam," he said gently, "I hope you're proud of what Linda has done. The congregation is moved." I asked him plainly why he had spoken my name, then turned the gratitude toward her. He looked startled, then defensive, saying he had been confused, that the envelope had been passed along, that it was easier to honor the younger generation for appearances. His words cut like frost. For appearances, my faith had taught me sacrifice was between a soul and God, not a performance staged for applause. Yet even the pastor preferred the story that fit neatly with the image of renewal. Youth replacing age. After he left, I sat by the window and watched the street lamps flicker on. I thought of how quickly truth can be rewritten when no one bothers to check. A quiet fear settled in. If Linda could steal this moment, she could rewrite much more. She could reshape the past, even the years I had worked, until the town believed her version instead of mine. One afternoon, while walking past the town square, I saw posters taped to shop windows. They advertised a legacy talk to be hosted at the community center, with Linda Caldwell as the featured speaker. The bold print read, "Continuing the Caldwell tradition of integrity and service." My chest tightened. That was my life, my name. My ledger turned into a slogan for her ambition. I attended that talk, sitting in the back row, watching as she spoke with practiced ease. She told stories lifted straight from my life, reshaped to highlight her supposed vision for the future. She spoke of giving neighbors credit during hard times, but she presented it as if she had been the one to bear the burden. People applauded, nodding, some even tearing up, and when she thanked me, it was with the tone of someone indulging an old relic. My mother inspired me, but it is my duty now to carry forward what she no longer can. The audience clapped louder, swept up in the drama. My name had been transformed into a preface, a stepping stone beneath her rising image. On the way out, I overheard Grace Miller, Linda's wealthy friend, praising her vision. "This cafe idea will thrive. People love nostalgia when it's packaged right. And with your family story, no one will resist." My stomach turned. They were planning to monetize my sacrifices, polish them into decor for lattes and pastries. That night, I placed the bulletin from church beside the invitation to Linda's event, and then my ledger beside both. 3 artifacts, each carrying a different version of truth. The town saw her version now. Pastor Daniel supported it for appearances, and even Mark had chosen convenience. I sat with the weight of it, not just the betrayal but the realization that silence would let it harden into fact. As I closed the ledger, I whispered to myself words that sounded less like despair and more like resolve. She has taken my gift, and she has taken my voice. I will not let her take my life. The first sign of what Linda was building came in the form of a banner stretched across Main Street. It read Caldwell Cafe, honoring tradition, inspiring tomorrow. The name was mine, but the vision was hers. I stood under that banner in the sharp wind of early spring, staring at the word Caldwell as if it no longer belonged to me. People walked past with coffee cups, excited chatter about the new spot. None of them looked at me, though they knew who had carried that name through decades of labor. The cafe opened with fanfare. Linda stood at the entrance, dressed as if she had been preparing for this stage all her life. Her voice carried across the sidewalk as she told the crowd that this cafe was born out of the values instilled in her family, values of integrity and perseverance. Grace Miller, her closest ally, stood by her side, clapping first and loudest. Grace was known in town for her money and for how easily she attached herself to anything that glimmered with success. She leaned in, whispering encouragement to Linda, the kind that stoked ambition rather than steadied it. Inside, the walls were lined with framed photographs, my photographs, the store counter, the shelves, even a snapshot of me standing behind the register, tired but smiling. Yet beneath each frame, small plaques bore Linda's name as the one who preserved the Caldwell legacy. My face had become decoration, a relic displayed for her customers, while her name carried the weight of honor. She guided visitors to a corner where an old stool stood, one that had sat in the back of my store for decades. She called it Grandmother's Corner, a place meant for me to sit whenever I visited. I realized then she had turned me into part of the exhibit, like a rocking chair in a museum, proof of authenticity to charm paying customers. That day, I sat in the corner for a short while, because to walk out would have been to confirm the role she had scripted for me, the elderly figure, smiling faintly, out of place, but tolerated. People came up, asked me if the stories Linda told were true, stories I knew she had twisted or claimed as her own. Some patted my hand with pity, thanking Linda for keeping me involved. My silence felt like complicity, yet any protest would have been dismissed as bitterness. As the weeks passed, I heard Linda giving interviews to local papers, telling them how she had taken inspiration from her family's store to create a new gathering space for the town. She said she wanted to honor history while moving forward, but she never credited the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made. It was always her vision, her leadership, her courage. My life had become raw material, carved into a narrative where she was the hero and I the background. One evening, as I walked past the cafe, I caught sight of Grace inside, speaking with a group of investors. I overheard enough through the open door to understand they were discussing franchising, expanding the concept beyond town. Grace praised Linda's ability to turn heritage into profit. My stomach knotted. What had begun as a lie in a church was becoming a machine that could erase me from my own name, spreading far beyond the boundaries of the place I had lived all my life. At home, I opened the ledger again. The ink had faded in some places, but the words remained clear. Names, dates, amounts, notes of forgiveness. That book was my truth. Yet in Linda's hands, truth was pliable, shaped to whatever fit the story she needed to tell. A week later, Pastor Daniel announced during service that the cafe would be hosting a community gratitude night, sponsored by Linda and Grace. He spoke warmly about the importance of recognizing new leaders and fresh energy. His words stung, for in praising the new, he dismissed the old. The congregation clapped, their approval loud and eager. I remained seated, my hands folded tight in my lap. At the event, Linda took the microphone and told a story of how, as a child, she had watched her mother struggle to keep the store afloat, how she had promised herself she would someday rescue the family name from obscurity. Her eyes filled with tears at the perfect moment, her voice cracking just enough. People leaned forward, captivated, believing every syllable. She turned sacrifice into tragedy, and tragedy into fuel for her own triumph. When she finished, she called me to the stage. My legs felt heavy as I walked, the room buzzing with applause. She placed an arm around me, smiling as photographers snapped pictures. "This is where it all began," she said, holding me like a prop. Without her hardships, none of this would be possible. Hardships, that was how she framed my decades of work burden and failure that only she had redeemed afterward. Grace approached me, her voice sweet with condescension. Miriam, you must be proud. Linda is giving your story a second life. Not everyone gets to see their legacy honored like this. I wanted to tell her that honor built on distortion was no honor at all, but the words stuck in my throat. Grace wouldn't have heard them anyway. Back at home, I sat alone with the photographs I still had, ones she had not taken. In them, I saw customers smiling, children clutching candy, neighbors leaning across the counter in trust. Those memories were pure, untouched by her narrative. But if she continued, even those who lived them would begin to believe her version over their own. Memory is fragile, and ambition has a way of rewriting it. I told myself then that silence would not protect me. Silence would only cement the lie. I first noticed the change in Emily when she came to visit one Sunday afternoon. She had always been the grandchild who lingered by my side, asking about the store, laughing at the stories of neighbors I had helped, scribbling sketches of the jars and counters while I spoke. But that day she carried herself with a new sharpness, her phone in hand, her eyes darting as if she were already late for something else. She told me she had been working with Linda on branding ideas. Branding, the word landed like a foreign object in my kitchen. She explained that her art could give the cafe authentic character, that people would pay more if the story was packaged visually. Then she pulled out a sketchpad and showed me drawings of posters she was designing: my face, my hands, my legible, stylized, romanticized, under the heading, The Caldwell Legacy. My throat closed as I looked at the caricature of myself, turned into advertising. When I asked her gently why she needed to put my image there, she laughed nervously. Grandma, this is how people connect now. It's not just coffee, it's culture. Your story sells. She said it as if it were a compliment, but what I heard was that my life had been reduced to a commodity. A week later, I saw her work displayed inside the cafe. Large prints of her sketches hung on the walls. Customers posed with them, smiling beside a poster that read, "Inspired by Miriam, brought to life by Linda." I felt a coldness spread through me. Not only had Linda stolen my offering, my recognition, my past, but now she had enlisted my granddaughter to seal the theft with art. Emily waved to me brightly across the room, proud of what she had created, blind to the humiliation it brought me. During one of those visits, Linda staged a moment. Before the customers, she called me forward, held my shoulders, and told the crowd that her mother's sacrifices had nearly broken her family. But through resilience, Linda had rebuilt the Caldwell reputation. The audience clapped. My name was used as evidence of failure, her presence as proof of redemption. And Emily stood nearby, capturing it all on her phone for the cafe as social media. I returned home and sat in the quiet, wondering when love had turned into theater. I remembered the nights I had rocked Emily to sleep while her parents worked late, the summers she spent in the store drawing pictures of the candy jars. Those memories belonged to us. Now they were being edited into a narrative where she played assistant to Linda's ambition. One evening she stopped by again, holding a box of merchandise. Inside were mugs and shirts printed with slogans, "The Caldwell Way," "Strength Through Struggle," her story, our future. My image, simplified into a sketch, stared up from the ceramic. She told me these would fund community events and prove the cafe was more than a business. She spoke with conviction, her voice filled with the eagerness of youth convinced of a cause. Yet the cause was not truth. It was profit cloaked in the language of service. When I tried to tell her that memory should not be sold, she frowned. Grandma, sometimes stories need to be reshaped for people to care. If we cling to the old way, everything you did will be forgotten. This is how it survives. She believed she was protecting me, but she was protecting Linda's version of me, not the truth of who I was. The hardest moment came when I overheard her speaking with friends. They asked if I had really kept ledgers of debts, if I had let people buy on credit. Emily hesitated, then repeated Linda's line, that my generosity had left the family vulnerable, that Linda had been the one to ensure stability. Hearing my granddaughter echo that distortion felt like betrayal layered upon betrayal. The next week, Pastor Daniel mentioned the cafe again, praising the way the younger generation was carrying on the Caldwell name. He nodded toward Linda and Emily sitting together, their faces glowing with approval. I remained seated, invisible. My name had become shorthand for weakness, their names for strength. That night, I opened my ledger once more. The faded ink whispered back the names of those I had helped, people who would have gone hungry without the credit I extended. I traced the lines with my finger, steadying myself. The book was more than numbers. It was proof that my choices had meaning, no matter how they twisted it. I knew what I had done, but knowledge in silence meant nothing. Every event, every poster, every mug, pushed Linda's version further into permanence. Emily's art gave it beauty, Pastor Daniel's blessing gave it authority, and Mark's indifference gave it protection. I realized the walls were closing in, and if I did not act, my own life would vanish into someone else's story. So I whispered, into the quiet, not a plea but a vow. They may dress my sacrifices in false colors, but I will not watch them erase me. The town council hosted an open meeting that spring, and Linda positioned herself at the center of it. She had been invited to speak about heritage entrepreneurship, a phrase that tasted like ash in my mouth. The auditorium filled with familiar faces, many of them families who had once stood across my counter. People I had extended credit to when layoffs swept through the factory. They sat listening to Linda as if she were unveiling a gospel. She spoke about the hardships of her childhood, the debt her mother had left behind, and how she had shouldered the burden to restore the family's good name. Her voice broke at just the right places. She let tears gather when she described how she grew up watching failure, vowing to turn it into resilience. The crowd leaned in, nodding, believing. Each word sliced through me because I knew it was my sacrifice. She was twisting my nights of struggles she was branding as shame. When it came time for public comments, a man stood up from the back. I recognized him instantly, one of the many who had scribbled his name in my ledger during hard winters. But instead of gratitude, he cleared his throat and said, "Linda, you've been a blessing. We all know what your mother's mistakes cost this town, but you've shown us redemption." My knees nearly buckled. To hear a debt turned into disgrace and forgiveness twisted into a black mark was a blow sharper than any I had known. I walked home under streetlights that blurred in my vision. The betrayal had spread further than I imagined. Memory was no longer just fading. It was being replaced. Even those who had lived it were adopting Linda's version because it was easier to believe a young woman had saved them than to admit they had once depended on an aging grocer's mercy. Days later, I passed Caldwell Cafe on my way to church. In the window was a new display, a mannequin dressed in an apron that looked almost identical to mine. A sign beside it read, "The struggles that built us." Customers pointed, laughing softly, as if the hardships of my life were part of the decor. I paused long enough to see Emily standing inside, explaining to visitors how the exhibit represented perseverance through generational hardship. She gestured at the mannequin, as though it were me. At the service, Pastor Daniel delivered a sermon on renewal, praising those who carried forward the values of their families. He glanced toward Linda while speaking. His words were not aimed at me, though once they might have been. I felt invisible, stripped of the respect I had thought was unshakable. One evening, Linda arrived at my house unannounced. She sat at my table, her tone heavy with practiced concern. "Mother," she said, "people are starting to talk. They say you're bitter, that you don't appreciate what I'm doing. Don't let pride ruin the legacy I'm building." She leaned closer. "If you would just acknowledge your limits, everyone would be at peace." Her eyes hardened with that final word, peace. She wasn't offering it. She was demanding silence. I held her gaze and said nothing. She mistook my quiet for surrender. When she left, I reached for the ledger again. Its weight steadied me, reminding me that the truth lived there, even if no one else remembered. The following week, flyers appeared around town advertising a fundraising gala at the cafe. The headline read, "Lifting the Burden, Honoring the Next Generation." Beneath it was a photograph of Linda smiling, with Emily by her side. The subtext was clear: Linda as the savior, Emily as the heir, and me as the burden. They had overcome. At the gala, Linda took the microphone once more, her voice trembling with sincerity. She told the room how caring for an aging parent had been a heavy responsibility, how she had sacrificed her own ease to uphold the Caldwell name. People applauded, some dabbing at their eyes, while I stood in the back unseen. My existence had been recast as dead weight, my years of work reframed as obstacles. When the music began and guests mingled, I overheard Grace boasting about plans to expand the cafe concept into neighboring towns. She spoke of investors eager to capitalize on the story. "It's the perfect narrative," she said. "Struggle, redemption, legacy, it sells itself." She glanced toward me with a smile that carried no kindness, only triumph. On my walk home, I realized Linda was not only erasing me, she was selling the erasure. The humiliation I endured in silence was being turned into profit, and the more she succeeded, the harder it would be to reclaim what was mine. That night, as I placed the ledger on my lap, I whispered aloud to the quiet, "If they see me only as a burden, then I will carry the truth alone until I can place it where they cannot ignore it." I did not know how yet, but I knew I would not let their story become the only one. The night I learned the truth about what Linda had done came on a rain-slick evening. I had just returned from church, my shoes damp, when there was a knock at the door. On the porch stood Mr. Collins, the lawyer who had been a close friend of my late husband. He held his hat low against the weather and asked if he might come in. I hadn't seen him in years, but the look on his face told me his visit was not for pleasantries. He sat at my table, the same one where Linda had once pressed those papers toward me. He placed a folder in front of me, and the weight of it felt heavier than paper should. "I've been approached about some contracts," he said. "Your daughter is selling rights." I asked what rights he meant. He opened the folder and showed me documents stamped with signatures and seals, an agreement transferring the Caldwell legacy to a media company. There were clauses about intellectual property, trademarks, and adaptation rights. My eyes caught on the line that claimed I had willingly signed over my life story nearly 20 years ago. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but I knew instantly it was forged. Mr. Collins explained that Linda had already received an advance. The company intended to produce a film series based on the Caldwell story, portraying her as the one who saved the family from disgrace. My name would be used, my likeness dramatized, but my truth would be twisted into humiliation for profit. He looked at me steadily and said, "If this goes forward, their version will become the official record." I sat still, staring at the papers. To see my entire life reduced to a commodity, traded like a brand, was a blow deeper than any insult. Spoken in church, they were not just rewriting me in the town's eyes. They were selling the falsehood to strangers across the country. If the contract was fulfilled, my voice would be buried under scripts and performances, my sacrifices flattened into spectacle. Mr. Collins assured me he would help if I wished to contest it. His voice carried the gravity of a man who knew battles like this were uphill. "The problem," he said, "is that people will believe what they see on screen. And once it's out there, it won't matter what's true." After he left, I paced the house. The walls felt closer than they ever had. I thought of the nights I had written in my ledger by lamplight, careful to record each act of trust, each small mercy. Those names represented real people, real families, who had eaten because I chose integrity over profit. Yet here I was, being recast as a failure so Linda could stand taller. The following week, the town buzzed with excitement over news that the Caldwell cough was being considered as the setting for scenes of the upcoming production. Grace spoke, loudly in the square, boasting of the opportunity, her jewelry flashing as she waved her hands. She called it a chance for the town to be recognized, to attract tourists. People smiled and nodded, eager for attention. No one seemed to question the cost of trading truth for entertainment. I forced myself to step inside the cafe again, to see what was being prepared. On a corkboard near the counter, Linda had pinned concept art from the media company. One sketch showed a gray-haired woman hunched behind a register, her face shadowed in shame. Another showed a radiant younger woman, lifting a banner marked Caldwell, leading the town forward. Customers studied them with fascination, laughing at the dramatization. I stood silent, staring at my own erasure. Emily approached with a bright smile, pointing out details she had helped design. "Isn't it powerful?" she asked. "They want to capture the contrast struggle versus redemption. It makes the story universal." I felt the words pierce me, because to her it was art, but to me it was my life hollowed out and repainted. That evening, I pulled the ledger from its drawer once more. I ran my hand over the leather, cracked and worn from years of use. Inside, I reread the names, the debts forgiven, the notes of compassion. These were not failures. They were choices. If the film went forward, no one would know this truth unless I placed it where it could not be ignored. I began reaching out quietly. A call to an old neighbor, a visit to a family who still lived nearby. One by one, I asked them to remember. Some looked surprised, as if they had nearly forgotten, but as I described the entries in the ledger, recognition returned to their faces. "Yes," one man said, "my father spoke of you keeping our family fed that winter." Each memory I rekindled was a spark, and I clung to them as if they were lifelines. Still, the tide was against me. Linda's voice dominated the public sphere, amplified by Grace's money and Emily's artwork. Mark stayed silent, avoiding me when we crossed paths. Pastor Daniel spoke gently when I questioned him, but his answers only confirmed what I already knew. Appearances mattered more to him than accuracy. I felt the net tightening. The cafe, the church, the investors, even my own blood had aligned behind the story Linda had created. The contract Collins showed me meant the lie would not stop in our town. It would spread outward, packaged and sold, until strangers repeated it as if it were gospel. I sat alone in my kitchen with the ledger open before me, and told myself, this is not over. The first whisper that someone had begun to doubt Linda came from an unexpected corner. I was leaving church one Sunday when Diane Harper stopped me on the steps. She had been a neighbor decades ago, a woman who once borrowed flour from my kitchen and repaid it with pies in the summer. She was now on the church council, respected for her directness. She leaned in, lowering her voice so others wouldn't hear. Miriam, I've been listening to the stories going around. They don't match what I remember. Her eyes searched mine, as if she wanted me to confirm her suspicion, but also feared the cost of knowing. That brief exchange planted something inside me. For months I had felt surrounded by walls of lies, but here was a crack. I invited her to my home a few days later. When she arrived, I placed the old ledger on the table. She brushed her fingers across its worn cover before I even opened it. I showed her the entries, pointing to her own family's name. Your husband came to me when the factory cut hours. You bought food on credit until spring. Her lips trembled as she read the line. She whispered, I had forgotten. I told her forgetting was not her fault. Forgetting was convenient for those who wanted to reshape the past. Diane sat quietly, then said she had heard Linda telling investors that the Caldwell name needed saving from scandal, that the town would rally if given a hero. Diane's face hardened. You were never a scandal. In that moment I knew I had gained an ally. Word spread quickly that Linda had secured a contract with a national chain to expand the cafe. Grace boasted openly that the signing would take place at the town hall, a ceremony with cameras and dignitaries. The entire community was invited to witness the moment. To them it was progress. To me it was the erasure sealed in ink. In the days leading up to it, I walked the streets, ledger in hand, visiting those I had once helped. Many looked at me with polite confusion at first, as though I were dredging up relics better left buried. But when I read aloud the notes, written in my own hand, paid in full, no interest, delayed until harvest, I saw eyes soften. Some wept quietly, realizing they had let Linda's narrative replace their own memories. One man clasped my hands and said, I always knew you carried us through, Miriam. Shame on me for forgetting. Those words fortified me. Piece by piece, I rebuilt a chorus of truth, voices that could not be ignored. Diane accompanied me one evening as I visited another family. She spoke firmly, reminding them how their children had eaten because of my trust. With her standing beside me, it no longer felt like I was shouting into silence. It felt like testimony gathering strength. Meanwhile, Linda's public presence grew louder. She gave interviews about her business vision, insisting she was reclaiming a tarnished name. She spoke of me only as an obstacle, a tragic figure weighed down by mistakes, one she had generously transformed into inspiration. Each time I heard her words, I clenched the ledger tighter, as if it might shatter from the pressure. The night before the signing ceremony, Diane came to my home again. She said, you cannot go in there with only words. You need evidence they can see. I laid the ledger before her, its spine creaking as it opened. She nodded slowly. Bring it with you. Let the town hear their own names. On the day of the event, the town hall buzzed with anticipation. Banners hung from the rafters, proclaiming Caldwell Calf, a story of renewal. Linda stood at the front in a tailored suit, Grace glowing at her side, Mark seated near the stage, and Emily arranging decorations with a camera in hand. Pastor Daniel offered a prayer, blessing the endeavor. The applause was deafening, and for a moment I felt drowned in the sea of approval for the very woman who had stolen everything from me. When the speeches began, Linda stepped forward, her voice smooth, her smile radiant. She spoke of sacrifice, resilience, and redemption. She described her mother as a symbol of past hardship, while she, the daughter, had transformed pain into prosperity. The crowd rose to its feet, clapping until the walls shook. I held the ledger close against my chest, waiting. My heart pounded not from fear, but from the certainty that silence would mean the final death of truth. As Linda lifted the pen to sign the contract, Diane caught my eye and gave a single nod. I stood. The room grew quiet, uneasy with my interruption. I walked slowly to the front, the leather book in my hands. Linda's smile faltered. Grace frowned. Pastor Daniel shifted, nervously. I spoke clearly, my voice steady. Before you sign away our name, this town deserves to hear what it really stands for. I opened the ledger and began to read. Harper family, credit extended through the winter of 1979, paid in full. Johnson family, debts forgiven after the fire of 1982. Martinez family, no charge for 3 months when the father was laid off. Each name echoed across the hall. Heads turned, faces changed as memories resurfaced. Some gasped, some wept openly. Diane stepped beside me, her presence lending weight. She raised her voice. I was there. I lived this. What she's reading is the truth. The silence broke into murmurs. People began to nod, whispering to each other. The narrative Linda had built cracked under the weight of evidence. Linda tried to laugh it off, calling it sentimentality, claiming the ledger was selective, incomplete. But I kept reading, page after page, until the sound of clapping shifted away from her and toward me. I closed the book slowly, my hand firm on its cover. This, I said, is the Caldwell legacy, not shame, not failure, service, sacrifice, and truth. The hall erupted, not in unanimous applause, but in a roar of recognition that Linda could not control. For the first time in years, I felt the balance begin to tip. The fallout from the town hall was immediate. Some people avoided me altogether, as if acknowledging me would mean admitting they had been fooled. Others approached quietly, embarrassed, confessing they had let Linda's version replace their memories. But the most significant change came from the silence in the cafe. Where once Linda had commanded applause, now I saw hesitation in the eyes of her customers. Doubt had been planted, and doubt has a way of growing in the shadows. Linda responded, swiftly. Within days, she called a press event at the cafe. Cameras arranged, microphones lined up. Grace stood at her side, her presence a signal that money still flowed into the venture. Emily moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, snapping photos, live streaming, controlling the image. Linda began her speech by accusing me of clinging to a false past. She called my ledger an incomplete account, claiming I had romanticized mistakes to disguise mismanagement. Her words dripped with authority, the kind that comes from youth and confidence. She held up glossy binders filled with contracts and endorsements. She spoke of partnerships, expansions, a future in which the Caldwell name would be synonymous with progress. The cameras clicked, capturing her standing beneath my photograph, now framed as a backdrop to her ambition. She said I was welcome to be part of her vision, but only if I accepted the narrative she had written. As I watched from the back, unseen, I realized she was no longer speaking to me, or even to the town. She was speaking to investors, to outsiders, who didn't care about truth, only about the story that could sell. And in that moment, I knew she was preparing to erase me not just locally but nationally. That evening, Mr. Collins visited again. He told me the contracts he had uncovered showed Linda negotiating with a national chain. If she succeeded, Caldwell would no longer be a family name, but a trademark. The ink on those papers would not only bind the brand, but bury me. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed concern. Once it's signed, Miriam, there will be no undoing it through quiet means. I thanked him and told him what I already knew. I could not fight with money or lawyers. My weapon had to be memory, spoken aloud until no one could ignore it. In the days that followed, I gathered those willing to stand with me. Diane walked at my side, her voice strong, reminding neighbors what they had once known. Families opened their doors, some hesitant, some ashamed, but many agreed to speak publicly. If needed, I carried the ledger to each visit, not as proof for myself but as a mirror for them. Each name was a reminder they could not deny. Meanwhile, Linda doubled her efforts. Posters appeared across town, advertising the grand signing ceremony with the chain. The tagline read, Caldwell Calf, from struggle to strength. I stared at those words on the lampposts, my life condensed into a slogan that turned sacrifice into a marketing tool. On the night of the final investor dinner before the signing, I went to the cafe. I stood outside, the windows glowing warm with laughter, while inside Linda addressed a room of well-dressed strangers. I could hear her through the glass. Our story is not about the past, it's about transformation. It's about my vision to turn hardship into opportunity. They raised their glasses, toasting her triumph. As I turned to leave, Emily stepped outside. She looked at me, her expression conflicted. "Grandma," she whispered, "you don't understand. This is bigger than us. If we succeed, the name Caldwell will be everywhere." Her eyes shone with excitement, but beneath it I saw fear, the fear of choosing sides. I asked her quietly, "And what will it mean when people ask who Miriam was?" She looked away, unable to answer. The next morning, I walked to town with the ledger under my arm. At the square, people gathered, curious, unsettled after weeks of tension. I climbed the steps of the courthouse and opened the book. My voice carried, reading names, debts, and the words paid in full. Faces turned, some ashamed, some moved, some remembering aloud. By the time I closed the book, a crowd had formed. They didn't clap, but they didn't walk away either. They listened, and listening was enough to tell me the truth still had a chance. That night, Linda came to my home. She didn't knock. She walked straight in, her face blazing with fury. "You are destroying everything I built," she spat. "Do you think anyone cares about those old notes? They care about vision. They care about the future, not your faded ink." Her voice cracked with anger, not grief. I met her eyes and said, "The future built on lies cannot stand." She laughed bitterly and stormed out, slamming the door. When the silence returned, I placed the ledger back on the table. My hands trembled, not from fear but from resolve. Tomorrow would decide whether my name endured as truth or as an invention sold to strangers. The morning of the signing ceremony dawned gray, the kind of sky that pressed down on the town like a weight. I walked slowly to the hall, the ledger tucked under my arm. I had polished its worn leather cover the night before, not out of vanity but because I knew it was the only weapon I carried into battle. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. Investors, reporters, townsfolk, they filled the rows, chattering eagerly about the moment they would witness. Banners hung above the stage, Caldwell Cafe, expanding our story nationwide. My name was everywhere, but not as mine. It had been polished into a brand. Stripped of me. Linda appeared in a tailored dress, glowing under the lights. Grace hovered nearby, whispering instructions. Mark stood at the edge, his expression neutral, as though his role was only to exist without taking blame. Emily arranged the microphones, her face pale but determined. Pastor Daniel opened with a prayer, his voice smooth, calling for blessings on those who bring renewal to our community. Then Linda stepped forward. She spoke with authority, every word rehearsed. She told the crowd the cafe was more than a business, it was a movement, a way of honoring history while reshaping it for the future. She described herself as the one who had lifted the Caldwell name from ruin, as though she had carried bricks from a house she had never built. The room swelled with applause. When the time came for her to sign, she lifted the pen with a steady hand. But before the nib touched paper, I rose from my seat. The sound of the ledger snapping open echoed like a crack across the hall. The noise silenced the crowd. I walked slowly toward the stage, my voice rising. "This town deserves to hear what it is about to sell." I read from the pages, each entry crisp despite the fading ink. Harper family, credit extended for 4 months during the layoffs, paid in full. Ramirez family, debts forgiven after the flood. Johnson family, food supplied at no charge until the harvest came in. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Faces turned to one another, recognition dawning. Some nodded, some wept, some whispered shame for having forgotten. Diane stood beside me, her voice carrying strong. I was there. My family survived because of this ledger. What you hear is not nostalgia, it is fact. The weight of her words rippled through the hall. For every family I named, a face lit with memory, a voice added to the chorus. The room no longer belonged to Linda. It belonged to the truth. Linda tried to laugh it off. She dismissed the ledger as sentimental, claimed it was incomplete, insisted that my generosity had been reckless and dangerous. She raised her voice, declaring that without her intervention, our name would have been drowned in shame. But her eyes betrayed panic. She gripped the pen too tightly, her knuckles white. Then Mr. Collins stepped forward from the back. He held up copies of the contracts, his voice cutting through the clamor. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are applauding is not legacy but theft. These documents show that Linda Caldwell has already sold the rights to her mother's life story to a media company. If she signs today, this town's memory will no longer be ours, it will be property. The room gasped, the investors looked unsettled, shifting in their seats. Reporters scribbled furiously. Grace tried to intervene, but her words faltered against the evidence in Collins's hands. I closed the ledger and held it high. This book is not for sale. These names are not for profit. They are lives, families, truths, and they will not be erased. The applause began slowly, a few hands at first, then growing into a thunderous wave. People stood, cheering, their voices reclaiming the narrative Linda had tried to steal. Some shouted my name, not as pity, but as honor. For the first time in years, the sound filled me with something steadier than anger. It was vindication. Linda's face crumpled under the weight of it. She dropped the pen, the contract unsigned. Investors closed their folders, whispering to each other as they left. Grace followed them, her expression dark, calculating losses. Mark slipped away, unwilling to meet my eyes. Emily stood frozen, her phone hanging at her side, tears on her cheeks. When the hall emptied, I remained at the front, the ledger pressed to my chest. The building was quiet again, the banners limp in the still air. The false story had collapsed under its own weight. Later that evening, I sat by my window, the town square hushed outside. I thought of everything that had brought me here: stolen offering, the public humiliations, the cafe with my face turned into decoration, the granddaughter who repeated Linda's words, the son who had chosen silence, the pastor who preferred appearances, and I thought of the neighbors who had remembered, the ledger that had endured, the moment when truth broke through noise. I did not feel triumph, not in the way Linda once craved it. What I felt was steadiness, the quiet certainty of someone who had survived the storm and was still standing. Looking back, I see the lesson plain. In a family, betrayal does not always arrive as violence or theft. Sometimes it comes dressed as progress, as love twisted into control, as stories retold until even those closest to you forget the truth. What I endured was not simply losing recognition, it was watching my own children and grandchildren trade my name for their convenience. That is the kind of wound that cuts deepest for those of us who have lived long enough to know how fragile memory can be. The truth I carry now is cold but clear. Silence is consent. If you do not defend your life, someone else will write it for you, and their version will not be mercy, it will be whatever serves them best. At my age, I cannot fight with fists or wealth, but I can fight with witness. I can speak until the last breath, because voice is the one thing that cannot be stolen unless you give it away. So to those listening, those who have felt erased by children who no longer see them, or by families who prefer the shiny version over the hard one, do not stay silent. Do not let your sacrifices become someone else's prop. You may not have a ledger, but you have your memory, your witness, your truth. Use it, speak it. Even if only one person listens, it will be enough to keep it alive. And if you are younger, watching this unfold, remember, honor is not inherited like property. It is earned by truth. If you strip it from those who gave you everything, you will carry nothing worth keeping. This was my fight, but it is also yours. Do not wait for someone else to guard your story. Guard it yourself. Thank you for listening to mine. If you wish to walk with me further, through stories like this, subscribe and stay. The road is long, and we will travel it together.